Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, may the peace of our Lord be with you tonight. As you settle in, as the world outside grows quiet, I invite you to quiet your heart as well. We often meditate on the story of the Passion, a story so central to our faith. We think of Mary, his mother, her heart breaking at the foot of the cross. We think of John, the beloved disciple, standing by her, a witness to the sorrow. But have you ever stopped to truly consider the others who were watching? The beings who are not of this world, who have existed for ages, whose very essence is to serve and worship the one being crucified. What did the angels do? What went through the minds of the Seraphim, whose wings cover their faces from the sheer holiness of God, as they watched that holiness be spat upon? What did the mighty Archangel Michael, commander of heaven's armies, the one who cast out Satan himself, do as he watched his king, the Lord of hosts, be nailed to a piece of wood by mortal men? We are told a legion of angels was his, for the asking. A single word from his bloodied lips, and 12 legions, more than 72,000 celestial warriors, would have descended and ended the world in a storm of holy fire. But the word never came. They were commanded to stand down, to watch, to wait. Tonight, we are going to look at the Passion story through their eyes. We are going to try and understand the agony of the angels, the silent torment of beings of immense power and perfect love, forced to be still as the greatest act of love and the greatest act of evil unfolded at the same time. This is a part of the story not often told, a mystery hidden within the greatest mystery of all. So breathe deeply, my friends, and let us go back to that day, to see what the angels saw, and to understand what they did when the Son of God died. The air in the celestial courts had grown heavy, a stillness that wasn't peace, but a held breath. For ages beyond human counting, the song of heaven had been the constant worship of the Father and the Word, his Son, through whom all things were made. The angels, beings of pure light and holy fire, had known the Son not as a man of sorrows, but as the co-eternal splendor of the Godhead. They had watched him speak galaxies into existence. They had seen the foundations of the earth laid by his wisdom. His voice was the music to which all of creation was tuned, and their existence was a joyful response to his glory. There were the Seraphim, the burning ones, who hovered closest to the throne of the Almighty. Their existence was a continuous fiery cry of, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." They saw the perfect, untainted holiness of God in a way no other creature could. They knew the Son as the very definition of that holiness, the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. For them, the thought of this holiness being subjected to the filth of human sin was a paradox that threatened to unmake their understanding of the cosmos. Their 6 wings, with which they covered their faces and feet in reverence, now seemed to tremble with a sorrowful anticipation. The song on their lips felt altered, the triumphant cry of "Holy," now containing a note of deep, aching mystery. How could the Holy One be touched by the unholy? How could the source of all life be subject to death? Then there were the cherubim, the guardians. Their forms were majestic and terrible, a combination of man and beast, symbolizing the fullness of God's creation. 4 faces, 4 wings, moving like lightning, their eyes seeing all. It was the cherubim who were placed at the east of the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword that turned every way, to guard the way to the tree of life after man's fall. Their very purpose was to protect the sacred, to guard the boundary between the holy and the profane. They had seen humanity's first failure. They had enforced the sentence of exile. For millennia, they had stood watch, understanding that humanity was separated from the direct presence of God. Now, the very one who gave the command, the one who was the source of that life they guarded, was preparing to go into the heart of that fallen world, not as a conquering king, but as a sacrificial lamb. The guardians felt a tension in their very being. Their duty was to protect the holy, but the Holy One was willingly making himself vulnerable. The flaming swords in their spiritual hands felt heavy, their purpose confused. Were they to guard him, or guard the path he was determined to walk, a path that led directly into the heart of darkness? And there was Gabriel, the messenger. His essence was to bring good news from God. He was the one who had stood before Daniel and explained the coming of the Messiah. He was the one who had appeared to Zechariah in the temple, announcing the birth of the forerunner, John the Baptist. And most gloriously, he was the one who had come to a young virgin in Nazareth and spoken the words that began it all. "Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you. You will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus." Gabriel had announced the incarnation. He had delivered the message of hope, the news that God was coming to be with his people. He remembered the joy in Mary's eyes, the song of praise she sang. He had been the herald of the dawn, and now he watched as a deep and terrible night began to fall. The messenger of good news now had no message to deliver, only a silent, sorrowful watch to keep. His heart, if an angel can be said to have one, ached with the memory of the promise and the reality of the pain that was to come. And of course, there was Michael, the great prince, the archangel whose name was a question and a war cry. Who is like God? He was the commander of the armies of heaven. He was pure strength, perfect loyalty, the embodiment of God's righteous power. His memory was long. He remembered the first war, the war in heaven. He remembered the beauty and brilliance of the one called Lucifer, the morning star, the highest of all angelic beings. He remembered Lucifer's pride, the poison of "I will" that crept into his heart. I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly. I will make myself like the Most High. Michael remembered the horror of that blasphemy, the tearing of heaven's perfect unity. And he remembered rising up, not in his own power, but in the power of the name of God, leading the loyal angels against the dragon and his followers. The war had been fierce, a clash of light and darkness, of truth and lies. And Michael's cry, "Who is like God?" had been the weapon that broke the rebellion. He had cast Satan and his angels out of heaven down to the earth. He knew, better than any other, the nature of the enemy. He knew Satan's hatred for God and for humanity, which was made in God's image. For all the centuries since, Michael and his legions had been engaged in that spiritual war. They had fought for the souls of men, protected the prophets, and stood guard over the nation of Israel. And all of it, all of that history, was in preparation for this moment, the moment when the Son of God himself would enter the battlefield in the flesh. Michael had watched over the young Jesus. He and his warrior angels had been there, unseen, in the wilderness, after the 40 days of fasting and temptation. When Jesus had stood firm and declared, "Be gone, Satan," it was Michael who felt a thrill of victory. And the scripture says, "The devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him." Michael remembered bringing him sustenance, seeing the physical weakness of the one who was eternally strong. It was a moment of tender service that forged an even deeper bond of loyalty in the archangel's heart. Now, as Jesus entered Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, hailed as a king, Michael saw not just the cheering crowds, but the seething demonic forces stirring in the background. He saw the envy in the hearts of the priests, the fear in the soul of Pilate, the greed in the spirit of Judas. The enemy was marshalling all his forces. This was to be the final battle, the decisive confrontation that the war in heaven had only foreshadowed. And Michael, the commander of heaven's armies, stood ready. His legions were arrayed, their swords of light eager for the command. They were ready to defend their king, to annihilate his enemies, to end the rebellion of Satan once and for all. But the commands coming from the throne of the Father were not what he expected. The command was not to fight. The command was not to protect. The command was to wait, to be still, to allow it to happen. For a warrior like Michael, this command was more difficult than any battle. He had to watch the enemy he had dedicated his existence to fighting, the enemy he had personally defeated in heaven, now be allowed to approach his king. He had to restrain every fiber of his being, every impulse to defend, every instinct to protect. He and all the hosts of heaven, from the highest seraphim to the least of the messenger angels, were being called to be spectators in the most agonizing drama in the history of the universe. Their love for the Son was a blazing inferno, yet they were commanded to hold it in. Their power could shatter mountains and boil seas, yet they were commanded to be still. The great, heavy, silent waiting had begun. And as Jesus walked toward the Garden of Gethsemane, the sorrow of heaven was a palpable thing, a weight that even the mighty wings of the archangels struggled to bear. The Garden of Gethsemane was a place Jesus loved, a place of quiet prayer under the ancient olive trees. But on this night, the air itself was thick with a spiritual dread that was almost physical. As Jesus led his disciples there, the angels watched. They saw the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds grow thin. They saw the demonic hosts, the same spirits they had cast from heaven, slithering in the shadows, their excitement a venomous whisper in the spiritual ether. They were like jackals sensing a wounded lion, eager for the kill, yet still fearful of his power. When Jesus said to his disciples, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me," the angels felt the depth of that sorrow in a way the sleeping men never could. They saw not just a man in distress, but the creator of the universe taking upon himself the weight of all human sin and grief. Every lie ever told, every act of cruelty, every moment of rebellion from Adam until the end of time was beginning to press down upon his soul. The angels, who could not even look directly upon the fullness of his glory, now had to watch as that glory was being smothered under a blanket of cosmic filth. He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The angels heard this prayer, and it shook the foundations of heaven. They had heard his voice speak stars into being. Now they heard it tremble with agony. The cup was not just physical death. The angels knew what it was. It was the wrath of God against sin. It was the full, undiluted fury of a perfectly holy God against all the evil of mankind. And the Son, the object of the Father's eternal love, was volunteering to drink it. He who had never known sin was preparing to become sin. This was the moment of ultimate surrender, and it was a torment for the celestial witnesses. Michael the warrior wanted to intervene, to find another way. Surely there was another way. He could lead his legions, scour the earth of evil, chain Satan in the abyss forever. Why must the kings suffer? Gabriel the messenger wanted to bring a word of comfort, a message from the Father that it was over, that his prayer had been answered in the affirmative. But no such message was given. The Seraphim, the burning ones, felt the heat of God's coming wrath, and they recoiled in horror that it was to be poured out on the beloved Son. They saw the justice of it, for sin must be punished. But the target of that justice was the one they adored. He returned to the disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" The loneliness in his voice was a spear in the heart of the watching angels. The creator of countless worlds was utterly alone in his moment of greatest need. He who commanded legions of celestial beings had asked for the companionship of 3 mortal men, and they had failed him. The angels longed to rush to his side, to surround him, to offer their strength and their worship. But the command remained. Wait. He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." The resolve in his voice was as absolute as his agony. The decision was made. Heaven and hell had been waiting for this decision. With those words, the fate of the world was sealed. He was choosing the cross. He was choosing to drink the cup. And then the scripture tells us something remarkable. "And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him." 1. From all the countless millions, one angel was permitted to go to him. We are not told his name. Perhaps he was a cherub, a guardian. Perhaps a seraph, bringing a touch of heaven's fire to warm a soul growing cold with dread. Perhaps he was just an ordinary angel, given the highest honor in the history of the cosmos. Imagine that angel. He approached the Son of God, who was now in such agony that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. The angel did not come to fight. He did not come with a message to stop. He came only to strengthen. What could an angel do to strengthen God? He could not add to his power. He could not add to his divinity. But he could offer what Jesus had asked of his disciples: companionship. He could remind him that he was not entirely alone. He could minister to his humanity, which was being stretched to the breaking point. Perhaps he wiped the bloody sweat from his brow. Perhaps he simply knelt before him in silent adoration, a single point of light in the crushing darkness, a reminder of the heavenly home that was waiting for him. The other angels watched this one chosen brother with a holy envy. He was doing what all of them yearned to do. He was physically present, serving their king in his darkest hour. His actions were a representation of all their love, all their loyalty, focused into a single, tender act of service. But the strengthening was for the ordeal, not from it. The cup would not pass, and as Jesus rose, his face set like flint toward the coming betrayal, the ministering angel returned to the ranks, his duty done. The brief moment of comfort was over. The hosts of heaven braced themselves. The sound of shouting men and clanging armor was now audible in the garden. The traitor, Judas, was approaching, and the angels, their hearts a mixture of profound sorrow and burning love, watched as their king, their creator, the Lord of hosts, walked forward to meet his captors, to be handed over to the hands of sinful men. The time for waiting was not over. Its most terrible phase had just begun. The flicker of torches cut through the olive grove, a jagged, ugly light in the sacred dark. The angels saw the mob approaching, a disorderly mix of temple guards with swords and clubs and servants of the high priest. It was a pathetic army to come for the King of the universe, and the angels looked upon them with a mixture of contempt and sorrow. These men had no idea who they were arresting. They thought they were capturing a rogue preacher, a threat to their religious establishment. The angels saw them as they truly were, blind puppets, their strings pulled by the dark powers they could not see, their hearts filled with a fear and hatred they did not understand. And leading them was Judas. The angels had watched Judas for 3 years. They had seen him walk with Jesus, listen to his teachings, witness his miracles. He was one of the 12, an apostle. They had seen the darkness growing in his heart, the love of money that had become an idol, a foothold for the enemy. Now they watched as Satan himself entered into him, using him as the final instrument of betrayal. Judas stepped forward. "Greetings, Rabbi," he said, and kissed him. That kiss. For the angels, who existed to offer praise and adoration, that act was the ultimate perversion, a sign of love and affection used as a signal for arrest, a gesture of intimacy twisted into an act of profound treachery. A wave of holy revulsion went through the angelic host. They saw the deep sadness in Jesus' eyes as he said, "Friend, do what you came to do." Even then, he called him friend. Then the mob moved in, laying hands on the one who held the cosmos in his own hands. And in that moment, the fierce, protective instinct of humanity, a dim echo of angelic loyalty, flared up. Peter, ever impulsive, drew his sword and swung wildly, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant, Malchus. For a split second, it seemed the battle Michael had longed for was about to begin. The disciples were ready to fight. A single word from Jesus, and the angels would have descended. The Garden of Gethsemane would have become a furnace of divine wrath. The soldiers would have been vaporized. The city of Jerusalem would have trembled. But the word that came was not for war. "Put your sword back into its place," Jesus said to Peter. And then he spoke words meant as much for the watching angels as for the hot-headed disciple. "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" 12 legions. Over 72,000 angels. The number itself was a message. Michael knew what 12 legions could do. He knew that a single angel had struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. 12 legions could unmake creation. Jesus was reminding Peter and all of heaven that this was not happening because he was weak. It was happening because he was willing. He was in complete control. His submission was a choice, an act of supreme power, not powerlessness. Then he reached out and touched the servant's ear and healed him, an act of creation in the midst of his own decreation, an act of mercy to the servant of his enemy. The angels watched in awe. In the face of betrayal, he showed friendship. In the face of violence, he brought healing. He was living out his own teachings in the most extreme circumstances. But his words to the mob were sharp with truth. "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." He was showing them their own cowardice and hypocrisy, and at the same time submitting to the grand, ancient plan of God. And then the disciples his closest friends, the ones who had just sworn they would die with him, all fled. They left him alone, surrounded by his enemies. The loneliness he had felt in the garden was now complete. He was utterly abandoned by every human being he had called friend. The angels watched them scatter into the night, and their sorrow for their king deepened. He was alone now, truly alone, in the hands of the enemy. They watched as he was bound, his hands that had healed the sick and blessed the children now tied with coarse rope. They watched as he was led away, a prisoner, back into the city that was about to commit the greatest crime in its history. The angelic hosts moved with him, an unseen, silent, and sorrowful procession. They hovered over the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish elders, was illegally assembling in the dead of night. They listened to the parade of false witnesses, their lies like jarring, dissonant notes in the perfect harmony of God's truth. The angels, who could only speak truth, were forced to listen to this cacophony of deceit, aimed at the one who was the way, the truth, and the life. They heard the men contradict each other, their stories falling apart, yet the council was determined to find him guilty. Finally, Caiaphas, in his frustration, stood up and put Jesus under oath. "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus, who had been silent through all the lies, now spoke the truth that sealed his fate. "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." He was quoting the prophet Daniel. He was declaring his divinity. He was claiming to be the one Daniel had seen in his vision, the one to whom was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. For the angels, this was a glorious declaration of truth. This was their king. But for the high priest, it was the ultimate blasphemy. He tore his robes and cried, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And the council replied in unison, "He deserves death." Then the horror truly began. They spat in his face, the face the Seraphim covered their own faces from. They struck him with their fists. They blindfolded him and mocked him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" The angels watched as men, creatures of dust, dared to assault their own Creator. Every blow, every insult, every glob of spittle was an act of cosmic rebellion. Michael's hand tightened on his spiritual sword. Gabriel's face was a mask of grief. The cherubim looked on, their many eyes filled with a terrible sadness as the Sacred One was being utterly desecrated. And still, the command from the throne of the Father was unchanged. Be still. Wait. The plan, the terrible, beautiful plan of salvation was unfolding, and their part in it was the agony of stillness. They had to watch, and they had to let it be. The long, dark night of the soul of the universe had descended, and the dawn was still a long way off. While the King of Heaven was being condemned inside the high priest's house, a different but related drama was unfolding in the courtyard below. The angels, whose gaze could perceive all things at once, watched Peter. Peter, the rock. Peter, who had so boldly declared, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Peter, who had just drawn his sword in a futile attempt to defend his master. He was now trying to be invisible, warming himself by a fire among the servants and guards. The angels saw the fear in his heart. It was a cold, human fear. The fear of arrest, of pain, of death. They saw the demonic spirits that had been stirring up the mob now whispering in the ears of those around the fire, prompting them, using them. A servant girl approached Peter. The angels saw her not as a threat, but as an instrument. "You also were with Jesus the Galilean," she said. A simple statement of fact. And Peter's denial came out, quick and sharp, a reflex of self-preservation. "I do not know what you mean." He was lying to protect himself, and the angels felt the sorrow of it. This was the man Jesus had chosen to lead his church, and he was crumbling at the first test. Peter moved away toward the gateway, as if to escape, but there was no escape. Another servant girl saw him and said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, the denial, this time with more force, with an oath to back up the lie. "I do not know the man." The angels saw the second crack appear in the rock. The lie was getting easier. About an hour passed, an hour in which Jesus was being beaten and mocked just a stone's throw away. An hour in which Peter sat with his fear, the lie festering in his soul. Then others came up to him, their suspicions aroused by his accent. "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." This time, Peter's fear turned to panic. He began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." It was the third denial, the most vehement, a complete and total disowning of his Lord and friend. And at that very moment, a rooster crowed. The sound, so ordinary, was like a thunderclap in the spiritual world. It was the signal. The prophecy Jesus had spoken just hours earlier had been fulfilled. The angels watched as the courtyard door opened and the guards led Jesus across the yard on his way to the Roman governor. And for a moment, his eyes met Peter's. The angels saw that look. It was not a look of anger or condemnation. It was a look of infinite sadness, of profound love, and of deep, deep disappointment. It was the look of a friend who had been betrayed again. In that single glance, all of Jesus' love and all of Peter's failure were held in perfect, heart-breaking tension. The angels watched as Peter, pierced to the heart by that look, remembered the words of his Lord. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And the rock shattered. Peter stumbled out of the courtyard, into the darkness, and wept bitterly. His sobs were the sound of a broken heart, the tears of a man who had seen his own weakness and cowardice in the face of his Saviour's love. The angels did not condemn him. They felt a deep pity. They understood, in a way humans could not, the immense pressure of the spiritual battle that was raging. Peter had failed, yes, but the story of his redemption was not yet over. His bitter tears were the first step back, but their attention was drawn back to their king. As the sun began to rise, a blood-red dawn breaking over Jerusalem, Jesus was led to the Praetorium, the headquarters of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The Jewish leaders wouldn't enter the pagan building themselves, for fear of being ritually defiled before the Passover. The angels noted the bitter irony. They were meticulous about avoiding ceremonial impurity, even as they were in the process of murdering the Son of God, the very source of all purity. Pilate came out to them. The angels saw him as a man caught in a trap, a politician concerned with keeping the peace, with his career, with pleasing both Rome and the volatile local population. He had no real interest in Jewish religious squabbles. He just wanted the problem to go away. "What accusation do you bring against this man?" he asked. "If he were not a criminal," they answered evasively, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate tried to hand the problem back to them. "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." But they had a plan. "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." They needed Rome to do their dirty work. They needed the crucifixion, a Roman method of execution, to fulfill the prophecies and to bring the maximum shame upon Jesus. So Pilate went back inside and summoned Jesus. The angels watched as the earthly power of Rome stood face to face with the divine power of heaven. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked. It was a political question. Was Jesus a threat to Caesar? Jesus' answer was not a simple yes or no. He challenged Pilate's understanding. "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others tell it to you about me?" Pilate was dismissive. "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" And then Jesus spoke of his kingdom, and the angels' hearts swelled with pride. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." He was speaking directly about them. He was explaining to this pagan governor why the legions of heaven were being held in check. His servants, the angels, would be fighting if his kingdom were an earthly one. But it was not. It was a spiritual kingdom, and its victory would not be won with swords of steel, but with the wood of the cross. Pilate, intrigued, asked the question that has echoed through history. "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate's cynical, world-weary response was the tragedy of a man who had lived his life by power and politics, not by principle. "What is truth?" he scoffed, and without waiting for an answer, he went back out to the crowd. He knew Jesus was innocent. He told them, "I find no guilt in him." But the crowd, stirred up by the priests, began to shout. Pilate tried to find a way out. He offered them a Passover custom to release one prisoner. He offered them Barabbas, a murderer and a revolutionary, hoping they would choose the peaceful teacher over the violent criminal. But the demonic frenzy had taken hold. The powers of darkness were screaming through the throats of the mob. "Not this man, but Barabbas," they cried. Pilate was losing control. He had Jesus taken away to be scourged. The angels braced themselves. They had watched injustice and lies. Now they had to watch brutality. They had to watch as the perfect, sinless body of their Creator was subjected to the horrific torture of the Roman flagrum. The agony of stillness was about to intensify to an unbearable degree. The Praetorium was a place of brutal efficiency, and the Roman soldiers were experts in pain. The angels watched as Jesus was stripped of his garments, his back exposed. The Word through whom the universe was made stood vulnerable, tied to a post. The soldiers brought out the flagrum, a short whip with multiple leather thongs, into which were tied sharp pieces of bone, metal, and glass. It was a weapon designed not just to hurt, but to shred. The first lash fell, and a collective shudder went through the angelic host. The sound of the leather hitting flesh was obscene. They saw the skin break, the first lines of red appearing on the pure canvas of his back. The soldiers worked in teams, one on each side, raining down blows with a steady, practiced rhythm. With every strike, the leather thongs wrapped around his torso, the sharp objects digging in and then tearing away flesh as the whip was pulled back. The angels saw it all in excruciating detail. They saw the skin being ripped from his back, the muscle being laid bare. They saw the blood begin to flow, first in trickles, then in streams, pooling on the stone floor. This was the blood that had been spoken of by the prophets, the precious blood of the covenant, the only blood that could atone for sin. And it was being spilled in a dirty Roman courtyard, amid the grunts of exertion from the soldiers and their cruel laughter. Michael, the warrior, felt a white-hot fury. These soldiers, these mere mortals, were inflicting this on the Lord of hosts. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. He could end them in a thought. He could turn their bodies to dust and their souls to judgment. Gabriel, the messenger of good news, covered his face. This was the antithesis of his being, the ultimate bad news, the desecration of the one he had announced with such joy. The seraphim trembled, their cry of "Holy, holy, holy," becoming a whisper of sorrow. The holiness they adored was being violated in the most horrific way imaginable. And yet, Jesus did not cry out. He did not curse his tormentors. He bore the pain with a silent, resolute strength that baffled the soldiers and broke the hearts of the angels. They saw his body racked with agony, but they also saw his spirit, unbroken, fixed on the purpose for which he had come. He was bearing the stripes by which humanity would be healed. Each blow was not just a random act of cruelty. It was a payment. It was the physical manifestation of the spiritual penalty for sin. When the scourging was over, he was a mangled, unrecognizable ruin of a man. The prophet Isaiah had written, "His appearance was so marred, beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind." The angels saw that prophecy fulfilled before their eyes. The one who was the fairest of 10,000 was now an object of horror and disgust. But the soldiers weren't finished with their sport. Their cruelty now turned to mockery. They had heard Pilate call him a king, so they would make him a king. They threw a tattered purple robe, a soldier's cloak, over his bleeding shoulders. The coarse fabric sticking to his open wounds must have caused unimaginable pain. Then, one of them wove a crown from a thorny vine with long, sharp spikes. They pressed it down onto his head. The angels watched as the thorns pierced his scalp, his brow, his temples. More blood flowed, mingling with the sweat and spittle on his face. This was their king, crowned not with gold and jewels, but with the very curse of the earth that had sprung up after Adam's sin. They put a reed in his right hand, a mock scepter, and then they knelt before him in false homage, spitting on him and sneering, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They would take the reed from his hand and strike him on the head with it, driving the thorns deeper. The angels watched this whole grotesque coronation. They saw the Lord of the universe, the King of kings, being worshipped in mockery by the lowest of men. And they understood the deep, terrible symbolism of it all. This is what humanity, in its fallen state, does with its king. It rejects him, tortures him, and mocks him. Pilate, perhaps thinking that the sight of this brutalized man would evoke some pity from the crowd, brought Jesus out onto the balcony. "Behold the man," he cried out, "exe homo." He was presenting a broken, bleeding, crowned with thorns figure, hoping to satisfy their bloodlust. But there was no pity in them. The chief priests and their followers, their hearts hardened and their minds blinded by the enemy, began to scream, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate was exasperated. "Shall I crucify your king?" he asked them. And the chief priests gave the most damning answer in the history of Israel. They, the guardians of the covenant, the leaders of God's chosen people, cried out, "We have no king but Caesar." With that single sentence, they renounced their entire history, their covenant with God, their messianic hope. They chose a pagan, earthly emperor over their true heavenly king. The angels heard this as the ultimate blasphemy, the final act of national apostasy. The decision was made. Pilate, the coward, washed his hands in a basin of water, a futile gesture of offloading his guilt. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. But the angels knew there was no water that could wash away this stain. The crowd sealed their own fate, screaming, "His blood be on us and on our children." The sentence was passed. Jesus was handed over to be crucified. The angels watched as the purple robe was ripped from his back, likely tearing open the wounds afresh. He was given his own clothes back, and then the heavy wooden beam of the cross, the patibulum, was laid across his torn and bleeding shoulders. The King of Glory, who carried the weight of the worlds, now had to carry the instrument of his own execution. The sorrowful procession out of the city toward the place of the skull began, and the angels, their hearts heavy with a grief that could extinguish stars, followed their king on his final walk. The road to Golgotha was not long, but for the one carrying the cross, it was an eternity of agony. The angels formed an unseen corridor around Jesus as he stumbled through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. They saw the faces in the crowd. Some were weeping. Like the women of Jerusalem, their hearts moved with human pity. Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Even in his own agony, he was thinking of the judgment that was to come upon this city that had rejected its king. Others in the crowd jeered and mocked, their faces twisted with the same demonic glee the angels had seen in the courtyard. The spiritual battle was raging in the open now, the hatred of hell manifesting in the shouts and spit of the mob. The heavy wooden beam dug into the raw, shredded flesh of Jesus' shoulders. The angels knew his physical strength was gone. He had lost a massive amount of blood during the scourging. He had not slept. He had not eaten. His humanity was at its absolute limit. They watched as he stumbled and fell beneath the weight of the wood. The angels longed to lift it from him. A single one of them could have carried the beam as if it were a feather. Michael could have borne it for him. But the command was absolute. He had to bear it. This was the weight of the sin of the world, made visible in a piece of timber. He had to carry the curse. The Roman soldiers, impatient with the delay, grabbed a man from the crowd, a man named Simon from Cyrene, who was coming in from the country. They compelled him to carry the cross behind Jesus. The angels watched this man, an unwilling participant, suddenly thrust into the center of cosmic history. He was helping to carry the instrument of execution for the Son of God. Perhaps he did it with resentment, perhaps with fear, but he did it. He was, for a moment, sharing the burden. It was a small, forced act of mercy in an ocean of cruelty. Finally, they reached the place. Golgotha, the place of the skull. A barren, ugly hill outside the city walls, a place of death and public shame. The angels looked upon it with dread. This was the stage for the final act. They watched as the soldiers offered him a drink of wine mixed with myrrh, a crude anesthetic to dull the pain. He tasted it, but refused to drink it. He would not numb his senses. He would face the full horror of what was to come with a clear mind and a willing heart. This act of resolve sent another wave of awe through the celestial hosts. And then they laid him down, stretching his arms out upon the crossbeam. A soldier took a heavy iron spike, long and square-cut, and placed its point against the palm of his hand. The angels saw the Son of God look up at the soldier, his eyes filled not with hate, but with a sorrowful love. Another soldier raised a heavy mallet. The angels, who existed in a realm of timeless praise, now found themselves in a moment that seemed to stretch into a horrifying eternity. They saw the mallet rise. They saw it fall. The sound of the hammer striking the nail, driving it through flesh and sinew and bone and into the wood. That sound echoed through heaven and hell. It was the sound of the ultimate act of human rebellion. It was the sound of the ultimate act of divine love. It was the sound of a covenant being sealed in blood. It was the sound of the war for humanity reaching its terrible, necessary climax. A second nail, a third. They drove them through his feet, pinning the Lord of Life to the tree of death. Then the soldiers, with grunts of effort, hoisted the cross into the air and dropped it with a jarring thud into a hole in the ground. The shock of it would have torn at his wounds, sending waves of fresh, searing pain through his body. And there he was, suspended between heaven and earth, a public spectacle of shame and agony. The King of the universe, the author of life, was being executed by his own creation. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign to be nailed, an inscription written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, the languages of religion, law, and culture. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Pilate meant it as a final insult to the Jewish leaders who had forced his hand. But the angels knew it was a proclamation of truth, a royal title placed upon a throne of pain for all the world to see. The soldiers, their work done, sat down at the foot of the cross and gambled for his clothes, fulfilling the prophecy of the psalmist. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. 2 thieves were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. He was literally numbered with the transgressors. And then, from the cross, his first words. Not a curse, not a cry of pain, but a prayer that stunned the angels with its impossible grace. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was praying for the soldiers who had just nailed him to the wood. He was praying for the mob that was screaming insults at him. He was praying for the priests who had engineered his murder. He was praying for all of humanity, for all of us who, in our sin, are complicit in this act. The angels, whose very being burned with a desire for justice, were now given a lesson in mercy that transcended all their understanding. They were watching the source of all forgiveness purchase that forgiveness for his own murderers at the very moment they were murdering him. The depths of the love they were witnessing were deeper than the cosmos, more profound than eternity itself. And they could only watch in silent, holy, heartbroken awe. From the 9th hour, a supernatural darkness fell over the land. It was not the darkness of a passing cloud or an eclipse. It was a thick, palpable gloom, as if creation itself were ashamed to look upon what was happening to its creator. The angels understood this darkness. It was a sign from the Father. It was the outward manifestation of the spiritual horror of the moment. The light of the world was being extinguished, and the cosmos was grieving. In this heavy darkness, the mocking continued. The people passing by hurled insults, shaking their heads. You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. The chief priests and scribes joined in the scorn. He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. Even one of the thieves being crucified next to him added his voice to the chorus of derision. Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. The angels listened to this litany of hate and unbelief. They heard the enemy's triumphant laughter echoing in the spiritual realm. Satan believed he had won. He had turned humanity against its maker. He had engineered the death of the Son of God. He was gloating in his apparent victory. But then, something shifted. The other thief, his own body racked with pain, rebuked his companion. Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then this dying criminal, this man whose life had been wasted in sin, turned his head toward the central cross and spoke words of simple, astonishing faith. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He did not ask to be taken down from the cross. He did not ask for an end to his pain. He acknowledged his sin. He affirmed Jesus' innocence, and he believed, even as he watched Jesus dying, that he was a king who had a kingdom. In the midst of the deepest darkness, a tiny flame of faith had been kindled. The angels watched, their sorrow momentarily pierced by a ray of light. And they heard their king, his voice strained and weak, make a promise. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. A soul was saved. From the throne of his pain, the king was still exercising his royal authority, granting pardon and promising eternal life. The angels understood that this one act was a foretaste of the victory to come. Even in his dying, he was robbing hell and populating heaven. He was snatching a brand from the burning. Then he looked down from the cross and saw his mother, Mary, and standing with her, the disciple John. His heart, the heart of a perfect son, went out to her. He knew her pain, the sword that was piercing her own soul, as Simeon had prophesied so long ago, and even in his cosmic agony, he took care of her. Woman, behold your son, he said to Mary, giving John to her as a surrogate, and to John, behold your mother. He was creating a new family at the foot of the cross, a family of faith, bound not by blood, but by love and shared sorrow. He was ensuring his mother would be cared for. The angels marveled at this tender human love existing alongside the divine sacrifice. He was fully God, bearing the sins of the world, and fully man, loving his mother to the very end. After this, knowing that all was now finished, and to fulfill the scripture, he said, I thirst. This was not just a physical thirst, though his dehydration must have been extreme. It was the thirst of the psalmist, the thirst of a soul separated from the source of living water. It was the spiritual thirst of one who was experiencing the desolation of God-forsakenness for the first time in all of eternity. A sponge full of sour wine was lifted to his lips on a hyssop branch. He received it. The last prophecy of his suffering was fulfilled, and now the moment the universe had been dreading arrived. The darkness seemed to deepen, to coalesce around the cross. The weight of all sin, past, present, and future, settled upon him. And in that moment, he became what he was not. The pure, became sin. The beloved became the cursed. And the fellowship that had existed between the Father and the Son from before time began was, for a moment, broken. A cry tore from his lips, a cry that shattered the silence and shook the heavens. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? This was the cry of the damned. This was the cry of hell itself. But it was coming from the mouth of the Son of God. The angels recoiled. The seraphim hid their faces. Michael felt a cold dread that went beyond the fury of battle. This was the cup. He was drinking the cup. He was experiencing the ultimate horror. Separation from the Father. The source of all love was feeling unloved. The source of all life was feeling abandoned to death. The Father had turned his face away, unable to look upon sin, and the Son was utterly, completely alone. For the angels, this was the lowest point, the heart of the abyss, the mystery of suffering at its most incomprehensible. Their king was in hell, and they could do nothing but watch. The cry of dereliction hung in the thick, dark air. The spiritual torment had reached its peak. He had drunk the cup of God's wrath to the dregs. The payment was now complete. The price for humanity's sin had been paid in full. Then, from the cross, a final cry. This one was not a question of agony, but a shout of victory. A loud, clear voice that defied the weakness of his broken body. It is finished. Tetelestai, a single word in the Greek. The angels understood its weight. It was an accountant's term. It meant paid in full. The debt was cancelled. The transaction was complete. It was also a warrior's cry. The battle was won. The enemy was defeated. Satan, who thought he was victorious, had been utterly undone. By engineering the death of the Son of God, he had, in fact, sealed his own doom. The cross, which looked like the symbol of his greatest triumph, was actually the instrument of his final, irreversible defeat. The angels felt the change in the spiritual atmosphere. The oppressive weight of demonic glee began to shatter. The gloating of hell was silenced, replaced by a dawning horror as the enemy began to realize what had just happened. The power of sin was broken. The claim of death was nullified. The head of the serpent had been crushed, just as God had promised in the Garden of Eden so long ago. A great, silent cheer began to rise in the hearts of the heavenly host. The sorrow was still there, for their king was still dying. But now it was mingled with a triumphant awe. They had witnessed the greatest transaction in the history of the cosmos. Redemption was accomplished, and then one final utterance from the cross. The voice was no longer crying out, but speaking with a quiet trust. He had gone through hell, and he was coming home. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. This was not the cry of an abandoned soul, but the trusting words of a beloved son returning to his Father. The fellowship that had been broken was restored. The work was done. And having said this, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. He chose the moment. No one took his life from him. He laid it down of his own accord. The angels watched as the light, the life force of the very creator of life, willingly departed from his human body. And in that instant, the universe convulsed. The veil of the temple in Jerusalem, the massive, thick curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place, the place of God's earthly dwelling, the curtain that the cherubim had symbolically guarded for centuries, was torn in two. from top to bottom. It was not ripped by human hands from the bottom up. It was torn by the hand of God from the top down. The angels understood the symbolism immediately and profoundly. The way into the presence of God was now open. The barrier of sin had been removed. What Adam's sin had closed, Christ's death had opened forever. No longer would humanity be kept at a distance. Through the broken body of Jesus, anyone could now enter the throne room of grace with confidence. The cherubim's long watch over the barrier was over. Now they were to be ushers, inviting humanity in. Then the earth shook. A great earthquake rocked the land, splitting rocks and terrifying the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Creation itself was groaning, reacting to the death of its maker. Graves were opened, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. This was a foretaste of the resurrection to come, a sign that death itself was losing its grip. The Roman centurion in charge of the crucifixion, a hardened pagan soldier who had seen many men die, saw the earthquake and all that was taking place. He was filled with a great awe, and he made the first Gentile confession of faith. Truly, this was the Son of God. The angels heard his words and marked them. The gospel was already beginning its work, breaking through the hearts of those who had been its enemies. The victory was beginning to ripple out from the cross. But the angelic hosts themselves were in a state of profound transition. Their sorrow for the suffering of their king was immense. They had witnessed an agony that their minds could barely comprehend. Many covered their faces, unable to look upon the lifeless form of the one who was life itself. Yet, underneath the sorrow was a dawning, triumphant joy. They had seen the plan of God in all its terrible beauty brought to its completion. They had seen love conquer hate, grace conquer sin, and life conquer death. Their king was dead. His body hung limp and broken on a Roman cross. But the angels knew this was not the end. It was the pause. It was the silence between the lightning and the thunder. They had watched him die. Now they would watch him rest. And they would wait, with a burning, certain hope, for the command for the next and most glorious phase of the plan. They would keep their vigil over a borrowed tomb, waiting for the moment when their king would rise, and they could finally unleash the song of victory that had been building in their hearts throughout the long, dark day of the cross. The great work of redemption was finished, but the great work of resurrection was about to begin, and the angels would be the first to see it. The brutal work of the day was done. The crowds began to disperse, the mockers and the curious returning to the city to prepare for the high Sabbath of Passover week. A strange quiet settled over Golgotha, broken only by the weeping of the few faithful women who watched from a distance, their hearts shattered. The angels' attention turned to the lifeless body of their king. His work was finished, and now he rested in the stillness of death. But even in death, his body was sacred. It was the body that had been prepared by the Father, the body that had been overshadowed by the Holy Spirit in the womb of Mary. It was the temple that, though destroyed, would be raised again in 3 days. It was not to see decay. The angels watched as 2 men, secret disciples of Jesus, were moved by a courage they had not possessed while he was alive. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man and a member of the Sanhedrin who hadn't consented to their condemnation of Jesus, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body. The angels saw the spark of divine grace that gave this man the fortitude to risk his reputation and his position to do this honorable thing. Pilate surprised that Jesus was already dead, gave him permission. Joseph was joined by another, Nicodemus, the Pharisee who had come to Jesus by night so long ago. He brought with him a massive quantity of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight, a kingly portion for a burial. These two men, who had been timid in their faith, now acted with lavish love and reverence. The angels watched as they carefully took the body down from the cross. They saw the tender hands of Joseph and Nicodemus handle the broken form, the care they took not to cause it any further indignity. They gently removed the crown of thorns. They cleaned the blood and grime from his skin as best they could. The angels, who had longed to minister to him in his agony, now saw that ministry being carried out by the hands of redeemed men. It was a beautiful, sorrowful sight. They wrapped the body in clean linen cloths, layering in the fragrant spices, according to Jewish burial customs. The scent of myrrh and aloes, spices of preservation and honor, filled the air, a stark contrast to the smell of death that had hung over the hill. Joseph had a new tomb, one he had hewn out of the rock for himself in a nearby garden. The angels noted the symbolism. The first Adam's sin had begun in a garden, leading to death and burial in the dust. The last Adam's victory would begin in a garden, with a burial in a stone tomb, leading to life. They laid the body inside the tomb. The women watched, marking the place, so they could return after the Sabbath to anoint the body more properly. And then a great stone was rolled across the entrance of the tomb, sealing it shut. It was over. The Son of God was buried. The hope of Israel, it seemed, was buried with him. But the angels knew better. Their vigil now began in earnest. While humanity saw a sealed tomb, a final defeat, the angels saw a waiting room. They saw a cocoon in which the greatest transformation in history was about to take place. Legions of them stood guard over that garden. Not just the two who would later be seen by the women, but a countless, invisible host. Michael and his warrior angels formed a perimeter, a spiritual wall of fire around the tomb. Their enemy, Satan, had been defeated at the cross, but he was not yet bound. He and his demonic forces would have loved to desecrate that holy body, to interfere with the divine process that was underway. But they could not get near. The angelic guard was absolute. The cherubim, who had guarded the way to the tree of life in Eden, now guarded the one who was life itself, resting in the heart of the earth. Their mood was no longer one of agitated sorrow, but of quiet, intense anticipation. They were like soldiers waiting for the command to attack at dawn. They were like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on the most glorious play ever conceived. Their king was resting, as the Father had rested on the seventh day of creation. This was the Sabbath rest of the new creation. They watched as the chief priests and Pharisees, still insecure in their victory, went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember how that impostor said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people, 'He has risen from the dead.'" Pilate, weary of them, dismissed them. "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went and sealed the stone and set a Roman guard. The angels watched this futile human effort with a kind of divine irony. Men were setting a guard to stop the Lord of life from breaking out of a tomb. They were placing a seal of earthly authority on a place that was about to become the epicenter of all heavenly authority. Their guard of a few mortal soldiers was nothing compared to the legion of immortal warriors who were already standing watch. And so, for all of that Sabbath day, the world held its breath. The disciples were hidden away in a locked room, grieving and afraid. The leaders of Israel were congratulating themselves on having stamped out a threat. The Roman Empire went about its business. The world thought it had won. But in the quiet of the garden, the angels waited. They listened. They watched. They knew the prophecies. They knew the promises their king had made. They knew that death could not hold him. The grave was not his final destination. It was merely a temporary resting place before his ultimate victory was revealed. Their sorrow was now completely overshadowed by a hope so bright and so certain that it felt like a sun waiting to rise. They had seen what men did when the Son of God died. They had seen what the demons did. They had seen what the Father did. And they had done their own part. They had obeyed. They had waited. And they had borne their sorrow in stillness. Now their waiting was almost over. The third day was coming. And with it, the joy that would erase all the sorrow, the light that would banish all the darkness, and the song of victory that would echo through all eternity. The angels stood ready to be the first heralds of the new dawn. As we bring our time of reflection to a close tonight, let us rest in the deep peace that this story brings. The torment of the cross was real. The sorrow of the angels was profound. But neither was the end of the story. The love of God is so vast that it was willing to endure the cross to save us. And the power of God is so great that not even death and a sealed tomb could contain it. The angels who watched their king die in agony are the same angels who serve him now, risen and glorified at the right hand of the Father. Their sorrow has been turned into an eternal song of praise. The mystery of their stillness on that dark Friday gives way to the glory of their announcement on that bright Sunday morning. These same powerful, loving, and obedient beings are, as the Scripture tells us, ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation. That means they are sent to serve us. The warrior Michael, the messenger Gabriel, the fiery Seraphim, the guardian Cherubim, and all the countless hosts of heaven are part of God's great family, our elder brothers in the faith, watching over us, protecting us, and cheering us on as we run our own race. So as you drift off to sleep, know that you are not alone. The God who so loved the world that he gave his only Son is watching over you. The Son who endured the cross for the joy that was set before him is interceding for you. The Holy Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead is dwelling within you, and the holy angels of God are keeping their watch. May your sleep be deep and peaceful, and may your dreams be filled with the assurance of his victory. May you rest in the knowledge that no matter how dark the Friday of your life may seem, Sunday is always coming. Amen.